Hello, everyone. In this edition of MSW Students Explore Trauma, we will be discussing how natural disasters, specifically floods, can traumatize a person and how that manifests differently for individuals based on differing circumstances. I'm personally interested in this topic because I survived a terrifying flood in 2013, which devastated the community in which I lived. I was very close to dying in that flood and, oddly enough, never registered it as a traumatic event until almost a decade later, when I realized that I had recurring nightmares every time it rained during the night, that my house was going to float away. It took me years to even realize that these dreams were recurring because while they were happening, I was so crippled with fear, I was literally frozen in my bed until the morning came. Once I realized this was a trend, my mind was able to connect it to the flood, and I realized that I had all but wiped it out of my mind. Remembering it made me relive how deeply terrifying it was and how close I was to dying with everyone I loved, as well as opened my eyes to how efficiently I had blocked it out. It was through the dreams that I was able to reconnect with the memory and begin to heal from the residual terror. This class has helped me to see how my experience fits into the narrative of traumatic events and their fallouts. With that being said, let's take a second to discuss why surviving a flood qualifies as a potentially traumatic experience. In order to do that, we need to have a clear working definition of trauma. The DSM-5 defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing traumatic events, witnessing in person a traumatic event as it occurs to others, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of the traumatic events. SAMHSA argues that trauma is subjective and notes that a particular event may be experienced as traumatic for one person and not for another. Furthermore, they mention that individuals or groups can be traumatized by any of the following potentially cataclysmic natural events: tornadoes, lightning strikes, wildfires, avalanches, physical ailments or diseases, fallen trees, earthquakes, dust storms, volcanic eruptions, blizzards, hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, meteorites, floods, tsunamis, epidemics, famines, and landslides of fallen boulders.
Natural disasters include hurricane, earthquakes, tornadoes, wildfires, tsunamis, floods, as well as extreme weather events such as blizzards, droughts, extreme heat, and windstorms. These events can lead to many traumas for children and families, including displacement, loss of homes and personal property, changes in school, economic hardship, loss of community, and social support, and even the injuries and death of loved ones. The most immediate typical reaction to calamity is shock, which at first manifests as numbness or denial. Quickly or eventually, shock can give way to an overly emotional state that often include high level of anxiety, guilt, or depression. People might have lost their loved ones or their homes. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina was a large, destructive Category 5 Atlantic hurricane that caused over 1,800 fatalities and $125 billion in damage in late August 2005, especially in the city of New Orleans and the surrounding areas. The traumatic situation caused a lot of damage, leaving New Orleans citizens with nothing. Hurricane Katrina killed 1,833 people, and some are still unfound. People were left with no hope of missing out on any survival tools. As in the reading, historical trauma occurred collectively and intergenerationally among a group of people with a shared social identity or circumstance as a result of state-perpetrated violence or state neglect. Today, it is a historical trauma because citizens have not recovered from the drastic hurricane. Some people have lost people and some still have no proper electricity. The development difference in all three stages are different in many ways because as children and adolescents, they missed out on schooling, lost parents, nutrition. Adults lost everything and had to be strong to protect themselves and the younger kids. In the main developmental comparison, all three lost their shelter. As I research, children may be vulnerable to PTSD, stress following exposure to natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina. One group a researcher surveyed 2,362 4th to 12th grade students in 2005 through 2006 school year, and 4,896 fourth graders to 12th grade students in 2006 through 2007 school year. All children were from schools in Louisiana parish that were affected by Hurricane Katrina. For both population was worried about the medical center were either destroyed or power was lost. The concern that people were going to get sick because the contaminated food or water also weighed heavily on people's minds. All the health concerns for New Orleans came from the amount of flood water because there was so much of it that it was optimal breeding ground for mosquitoes, and the water covered everything, making nothing truly safe. And that is the characteristic of the population that we research, identifying the higher risk of negative impacts.
Okay, so as we step into the next section of the podcast, we are looking at the impact of trauma resulting from natural disasters on the biopsychosocial aspect of adolescents experiencing these events. So that would be like the major flooding event spoken about above. Basically, we are looking at how a traumatizing event like the one Sarah talked about earlier impacts every part of a child's life, biologically, psychologically, and socially. And of course, there are more levels to that, but these are the three big ones that we're going to look at. To start with, a good foundational support to look at are the research results from the ACEs test. If you're not familiar with it by now from study or from class, it is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test, which measures a number of familial or relational traumas that can happen to a kid and mess them up. For example, trauma experienced by a child at a young age can literally rewire and change the makeup of the brain, leading to many other serious psychological and social issues. Because of this, we know that trauma has a big impact on minds and bodies that are not completely developed, and yet this typically has big implications for these kiddos' futures. So for more information on research backing up the credibility of ACEs, or if you're just interested in it, you can just go to the CDC's website and type in ACEs, and a whole bunch of studies and information articles and a bunch of other stuff will show up. So I want to point out now, though, however, that the ACEs test does not address trauma caused by natural disasters or events beyond the scope of interpersonal relationships. And basically what this means is that we have confirmed that trauma hurts the whole child, but to look at the evidence of trauma caused by natural disasters, we have to look to other research, which there's actually quite a lot of. A Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, as you heard it referred to, research bulletin published in 2018 called Behavioral Health Conditions in Children and Youth Exposed to Natural Disasters, looked at a study done back in 2006 on the topic. It says research has consistently shown that children experience severe reactions to stress following a natural disaster, including clinical needs and behavioral health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as PTSD, functional impairments, traumatic stress symptoms, and other mental disorders. And that's by an article done by two names that I'm going to butcher, but they are listed in our references. I think it's Koplovich and Cloutier. Aside from the deep impact of natural disasters on kids, an article published in London in 2007 pointed out that this should be a bigger topic of discussion because of climate change. The more climate change that occurs, the more large-scale natural disaster events take place and the more children that get affected. Having said all of this, kids suffering from a trauma reaction after a natural disaster are definitely an overlooked part of society, especially after the buzz of the event has worn off and people stop donating time and money and kind of go back to their regular lives. But because their struggles and the effects of the event are so long lasting, we definitely need to make sure the support and care we provide is as well.
So thank you so much for that section, McKenna. So in this next section, we're going to be discussing the myths and misconceptions, as well as the socio-political discourse that follows. So there are a number of myths and misconceptions surrounding the topic of natural disasters. And these myths and misconceptions lead to significant adverse consequences. Myths specifically surrounding natural disasters can cause inefficiencies on a micro and a macro scale. Researcher David E. Alexander studies frequent misconceptions on the topic and the impact that these misconceptions have. So Alexander poses that some myths surrounding natural disasters are based on scientific misunderstandings, such as the myth that disasters are totally randomized exceptional events. But the reality is that they are a normal part of daily life, and in very many cases are repeated events. There are also many people who believe in the myth that claims that natural disasters just kill at random and they harm people without any respect for social class or economic status. Alexander challenges this myth by saying that the poor and the marginalized are more at risk of death than our high income or the middle class. Natural disasters impact lower income and marginalized communities due to the lack of infrastructure and emergency preparedness resources available to those who are marginalized in society. An example of this is with the case of Hurricane Katrina. So in New Orleans, where major flooding occurred due to the levee's failure, the destroyed neighborhoods were mainly in low-lying areas that were once marsh and swampland, and they housed predominantly African-American residents, with 29% of the population having incomes below the poverty line. A major consideration as to why people believe natural disasters strike randomly and harm people equally is in the name natural disaster. And because the term is climate-based, people might believe that the destruction that follows is generalizable to all populations. But as we know based on research, socioeconomic reasons can force people to inhabit regions with high susceptibility to disaster or prevent proper post-disaster management. There are many communities, political groups, organizations, and individuals who consider natural disasters to be just that, completely natural. They don't take the extra steps necessary to facilitate proper disaster relief for all socioeconomic groups. Just in 2018, the Trump administration transferred nearly $10 million away from FEMA, the organization that responds to disasters and emergencies, and redirected it towards ICE and the deportation of undocumented residents of the US. This reallocation of funding for natural disasters caused the eastern coast of the US to be even more vulnerable in the path of Hurricane Florence, claims that Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the vice chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and a member of the Homeland Security Committee subcommittee. Similarly, political norms and social policy impact how these resources for natural disasters are allocated. In April 2021, the Trump administration obstructed an investigation looking into why officials withheld about $20 billion in hurricane relief for Puerto Rico following the devastating aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017, which was one of the deadliest US natural disasters in over 100 years. The reason behind the withholding of funds was based on Trump's talking points of questioning Puerto Rico's capacity to manage these funds. Individuals in Puerto Rico face the repercussions of restricted funds based on assumptions by government administration. So beliefs surrounding the fact that climate change is not a real and pressing issue and myths that natural disasters hit every community equally can cause dangerous misconceptions and repercussions based on the natural disasters.
Now let's take some questions. The first question that we'll tackle is from Danny and Danny's group. Danny asks, what are some common trauma responses to surviving a natural disaster? First, trauma and the resulting post-traumatic stress that oftentimes accompanies natural disasters is, at least since Hurricane Katrina, something that's been studied quite a bit. Natural disasters in the form of hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and a wide swath of climate and ecological phenomenon are quite impactful. Natural disasters take homes, neighborhoods, and most importantly, lives. Natural disasters are economic disasters and medical and mental health catastrophes. In fact, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and even up to 6 months after the destruction that ensued, more than 14% of adults in the affected area reported that they were suffering from PTSD. The trauma responses from natural disasters manifest in both children and adults alike. Many of the noted trauma responses in Hurricane Katrina, for example, have been identified amongst others as being irritability, shock, confusion, and anxiety. Children often face even wider responses when measured, but many of their responses are difficult to acutely describe because of the limited vocabulary and reasoning skills present in young children. Other trauma responses and attendant augmented mental health problems and emotional symptoms include depression, addictive and destructive behavior. There may also be other pronounced trauma responses not directly connected by researchers to the natural disaster in question. For example, if a person's aunt dies in a hurricane and that aunt was the person's only healthy relationship, the ensuing social deterioration may not even be understood as having any direct relationship to the natural disaster in question. And since I think we have time for one more question, let's go to Taya. Taya asks, how does community organization, and I'm interpreting this as community organizing, play a role in the response healing for an individual who has survived a natural disaster? Well, first, let's think about community organizing in the context of natural disaster response. Usually when we discuss community organizing, we're talking about coordinating the people in the form of groups with the goal of social action to produce policy, social, and economic changes. However, in the natural disaster response context, community organizing efforts often emerge to fill in the gaps for decaying and deficient social infrastructure. Think political versus social, if that helps. And although it is argued that social workers are in the best position to tackle the myriad of difficulties that people encounter after a natural disaster, social workers are not involved in these efforts at any satisfying rate. Nevertheless, community organizing efforts have impacted how communities recover from natural disaster related trauma and harm. Community organizing efforts have worked on right to return issues, like trying to get folks from New Orleans back to New Orleans after Katrina, housing access work, neighborhood planning work, economic development work, and other more diffuse social justice efforts like reducing racial and class-related inequalities. Other efforts include disaster service coordination, like bringing in clean potable water and hygiene products to displaced persons, community assessments, both post-disaster and post-intervention, and community-based disaster management efforts. Even political education efforts have helped to get communities involved in self-help and mutual aid work. Now, just imagine if social workers were more involved at that level of the work. The problem may simply be pedagogical. Social work education focuses on social service, organizational management, administration, and human behavior work, and nearly ignores the type of policy advocacy and group work skills training that would prime social workers for community organizing work in the natural disaster response context. So thank you all for the wonderful questions.
All right, and so now when it comes to understanding traumatic events, such as experiencing a natural disaster, we know that it's important to consider how the individual experiences the event. Dr. Bruce Perry discusses this in his book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. Long-term effects are related to many factors, including issues of diversity. People experience trauma in different ways, especially when it comes to differently abled people. A natural disaster is a shared event among many people, but how it is experienced and processed is unique to each marginalized community and each individual. Researchers Catherine Hay and Catherine Margaret Pascoe claim that the vulnerability of disabled people following a disaster may be exacerbated by social, medical, physical, and economic factors such as limited mobility and necessary infrastructure, limited social networks, ill health, and low income. So for example, if a city is in an evacuation zone after a natural disaster, such as a flooding, able-bodied people who have the means to evacuate are more likely to evacuate compared to households with disabled or elderly individuals. People who have family or support system in nearby cities are also more likely to evacuate compared to differently able people who might not have these same support systems. Temporary housing or disaster welfare centers are often not accessible for differently able people, as they're typically designed for able-bodied communities. In addition, Mia A. Benevolenza and Leanne DeRime performed a study examining the aftermath of natural disasters on the mental, emotional, and psychological health of vulnerable populations. They found that while post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms declined over the time following the disaster, levels still remained high 43 to 54 months later, and psychological distress never returned to pre-hurricane levels. In the same study, researchers found that 30% of the sample had levels of psychological distress elevated enough to indicate probable mental illness. The study demonstrates that not having the access to resources for financial and social support during natural disasters can serve to create detrimental mental health outcomes and added risk factors. Minority populations, such as people with disabilities, mental or physical, can encounter struggles and challenges in recuperating and dealing with trauma after the disaster.
The type of diversity I chose is low-income citizens, with young adults, women, parents of small children, and those with low income suffering the highest level of PTSD. And mental health disorder, after the natural disaster, it was hard to get access to everyone's medication because citizens of Louisiana started looting for survival. Nearly 13,000 Louisiana residents with HIV and AIDS were estimated to be living in areas affected by Hurricane Katrina. Clearly, one major concern following a natural disaster is in the maintaining the infrastructure, of the healthcare system. For those impacted with a disease such as HIV, this is of vital importance. And disruption to the system can mean the delivery and availability of badly needed drugs or access to drug supplemental assistance programs. Several reported documented the recovery of the healthcare system. And healthcare providers such as the Medical Center of Louisiana of New Orleans, 1 year after Katrina, over 50% of professionals surveyed from the American College of Emergency Providers reported very little or no progress in the emergency care system. Thank you for listening to my topic.
For my section, I wanted to spend a little more time looking at the effects that natural disasters have on children. And as global warming begins to really tip the equilibrium of the climate in a direction that leads to more chaos, the issue of flooding and other natural disasters will become a more common household point of discussion and preparation. According to the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, over 1.35 million human lives have been lost in the last 25 years alone due to natural disasters. In 2018, 315 natural disasters affected more than 68 million people worldwide and led to the loss of 11,804 lives and financial losses of over 131 billion. Like we said before, these traumatic experiences are felt by many across the globe and can have long-term negative consequences for the children, including poor educational performance, substance use, mental and physical health issues. Due to the high rate of exposure for children and their small toolkit of skills with which to cope, natural disasters are one of the major traumatic risk factors for children globally. According to Carr and his research team, between 30.6 and 43.9% of children and adolescents have been reported to develop PTSD following natural disasters. That's a lot. Hagen, Solik, and Lieberman show that those with severe exposure to traumatic events show elevated internalizing and post-traumatic stress symptoms relative to those who witness violence and have had more moderate exposure. Carolyn Kuski, in her article titled Impacts of Natural Disasters on Children, argues that not only are disasters themselves stressful and frightening, but children can suffer psychological harm from the damage to their homes and their possessions, from migration, from the grief of losing loved ones, from seeing parents or caregivers undergo stress, from neglect and abuse, and from breakdowns in social networks, neighborhoods, and local economies. These and other consequences of natural disasters result in higher rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety in children than their adult counterparts.
I now want to take a look at race as opposed to ethnicity or other identity factors, right? So when we think about race and natural disasters, a recent study looked at Vietnamese and African Americans living in adjacent urban communities flooded by Katrina to observe differences in mental health outcomes. Although some differences seem to be related more to gender than race, Vietnamese Americans in the sample group demonstrated significantly better mental health outcomes compared to the sampled African American group. However, both groups showed improvement in their mental health from 2007 to 2018, with the African American cohort demonstrating greater improvement compared to the Vietnamese American group, with the advantage nearly reduced by the 13th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. In other words, African Americans face greater mental health difficulties in the short term, that's a period of about 2 years, aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, but this ethnic disadvantage disappears in the long term being the course of the study, the 13 years. The authors posit that African Americans' disadvantage in mental health immediately following Katrina was driven largely by poor employment prospects available for them at the time, with African Americans facing geographic displacement for significantly longer periods than both whites and Vietnamese Americans following Hurricane Katrina.
Thanks so much for your thoughts, Travis. Diving into how ethnicity plays a role in natural disaster trauma impacts in kids, it's important to note that right off the bat, different ethnicities have higher levels of trauma experiences resulting in PTSD as a whole. So that would just be even aside from the trauma caused by the natural disaster. For example, African Americans tend to experience higher levels of trauma and have those more experiences than white and Hispanic populations do. So in a study done in 2011 by Roberts et al., it talked about how African Americans tend to have an 8% increase in traumatic experiences as opposed to whites and Hispanic families, who tend to have more of a 7 to 7.5% increase in those. So that just kind of gives you a little background there. However, while there is some research on how these events affect people from different SES backgrounds, there's not a lot on how they affect different ethnicities, aside from what Travis mentioned some of, and some of the other articles talked about a bit ago in the podcast. So going forward, I'm curious to see if there will be more research on different cultural experiences of natural disasters and how communities deal with these traumas, either collectively or individually, because there is obviously a hugely diverse experience of natural disasters within the US alone, let alone the rest of the world, which I think would be obviously incredible area for further study. So that about wraps it up for us on this podcast episode on trauma caused by natural disasters. We hope you enjoyed the info provided, learned something, and have a great rest of your day.